Hi, welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis. Today we begin our two-part discussion of the Beach Boys' Friends album. Now recently when I've done episodes like this, I've talked about side one in part one and then side two in part two. I think we'll do it a little bit differently with Friends. We'll talk about side one and a little bit into side two here in order to leave room for a more general discussion of the album in part two. Also in these three cubicles where I usually do a theme, this week I put some of the new and notable albums that you might have seen on display in a record store had you walked in to pick up a copy of the Beach Boys' new Friends album on the day it was released, June 24th, 1968. It's an album that feels more produced and constructed deliberately than their recent album, Wild Honey. It also seems lighter, less dense, and more spare than the earlier Wild Honey album. Friends is also a very inward-looking album. There's the inward focus of transcendental meditation, stillness, quiet, looking toward inner peace. There's also an inward focus of a different kind. Staying home, keeping the world at bay, limiting who you see or talk to a few appropriately friends, and having them call or come to you. No longer getting around from town to town. Now Brian is staying home and letting the world, or at least a few select friends, come to him. For a long time, this was a period with seemingly few unreleased tracks or alternate versions. That changed with the digital-only copyright protection release of Wake the World, The Friends Sessions on December 7th, 2018. Brian has said while he thinks Pet Sounds is the Beach Boys' best album, Friends is his favorite Beach Boys album. He says, "It seems like it fits the way I live better. It's simple and I can hear it anytime without having to get into some mood." In his book, David Leaf talks about a lack of emotion probably being the thing that Brian liked about the album, since he didn't want to deal with emotions in 1968, particularly his own. I'm sure there's something to that. It could also be that these early months of 1968 were a relatively happy period with little emotional upheaval. It sounds as if hanging out and recording at home was a genuine pleasure at this point, having friends come to call and a baby on the way. This could be seen as a contented rather than emotionless album. And anyway, of course, not every album needs to be about big emotions, the same way not every film needs to be an epic. Sometimes taking an inward look and talking about small things is valid, and in the hands of an artist like Brian, you can be shown small things in new, exciting, and interesting ways. It's an album that's always felt very summery to me. Having been released just a few days into the summer of 1968, I'm sure people who bought it at the time make that association. Of course, I didn't buy it until years later in the early months of 1980, so I think there's more to that feeling than just an association with the time the album was released. What's more, the feeling is accomplished without a single reference in the lyric to summer or warm weather or sunshine. The closest we get is being told it's a hot, sticky day and busy doing nothing. To me, the music just feels like warm weather. Maybe like a hot, sticky day in places, but mostly like a beautiful day with an occasional light breeze. There's an effortless feeling about it. They really could have used this light touch in later years when they'd hit us over the head with lyrics about summer and sun and beaches. The album kicks off with Brian and Mike's Meant for You. This is one of 5 tracks recorded at ID Sound Studios in Hollywood rather than at Brian's home. In general terms, the tracks recorded before the end of March seem to be recorded at Brian's house. After the end of March, they seem to have been recorded basically at ID Sound Studios. The tone is immediately set with simple, spare instrumentation. In this case, it's Brian on organ, Bruce on piano, some very beautiful do-do-do wordless backing vocals from the group, and Mike on a lead vocal, giving probably his gentlest and most restrained vocal up to that time. Consisting of a single verse and running only 41 seconds, it immediately references meditation in the lyric. As I sit and close my eyes, there's peace in my mind, and I'm hoping that you'll find it too. In interviews, Mike has talked about wanting to return to Meant for You and add a second verse. In fact, as we discovered when an alternate version of the track was released on the Made in California box in 2013, there was another verse sung by Brian about ponies and their mothers and puppies and their brothers. The lyrics of this verse are twee, even for an album as lightweight as Friends, so I can understand why they cut it. Still, I wish they reworked the lyrics and kept the extra verse. There's no reason why a piece of work this nice should be limited to a mere 41 seconds. As it is, it serves as a nice introduction, almost an invocation to begin the album. There's a short promo film for Meant for You. Based on Mike's clothing and beard, I'm guessing it was made quite a bit later, probably 1970. In it, he sits down cross-legged as if he's getting ready to meditate, and then we cut to a quick shot of a statue that I believe is Shiva. Please let me know if I'm wrong about that. I don't know why they'd be making a promo film so long after the fact. It might even be that this wasn't originally intended as a promo film at all, and that the film and the music were put together at a later date. There's a more contemporary promo film for the next track, the title cut, Friends. The promo clip is enjoyable and features a pretty standard 60s pop group romp around a park. The Beach Boys minus Brian run from some kids, then run with the kids, then sit down for a picnic with the kids. It's good, outdoorsy, summery fun that suits the song. Friends was released as a single A-side on April 15, 1968, more than 2 months ahead of the album. The subject matter seems like something that would have really resonated with Brian. Friends have always been important to him. He's always liked working with friends, often collaborating on songs or even making records for somebody seemingly just because they shared a friendship. The song is simple yet affecting in a waltz time with a great lead vocal from Carl with support from Brian, and the showbizy vamp of the clarinets and saxes give it a bit of humor, kind of similar to what the Beatles had done with the horns on All You Need Is Love a few months earlier. The lyrics paint a simple and relatable picture of how friends support each other. It was definitely an unusual subject for a single, and despite all the freaky weirdness of 1968 music, nearly all hit singles were still about dancing or the old standby of romantic love. The single peaked at number 47 in the US on May 18th, more than a month before the album was released, and was the worst chart showing for a new Beach Boys single since 10 Little Indians back in 1962. The single did somewhat better in the UK, hitting number 25. Next up is the first Brian Al co-composition, Wake the World. Thematically, it reminds me a little bit of Country Air from the Wild Honey album. The singer seems eager to roll out of bed and wake the world to a brand new morning, and talks about having a big day ahead of me, though in keeping with the theme, doesn't seem to have any particular plans apart from being there when someone calls. It's one of the album's bigger productions and one of the more complex tracks, with bass harmonica, brass, strings, and vocal flourishes weaving in and out. Day turns into night, then back into day again with strings. We get the Wake the World section with a bass harmonica and brass, with tuba giving it a slightly comic feel. At the end of the song, we fade back into night. It's almost like a suite in 1 minute and 31 seconds. It's definitely an album highlight and was released as the B-side of Do It Again on July 8, 1968. The songwriting credit on the next track, Be Here in the Morning, is Brian, Dennis, Carl, Mike, and Al. Having just wakened the world to a brand new morning, the Beach Boys, or maybe more specifically just Brian, want someone to be there in the morning and also be there in the evening. The sound at the beginning that I always thought was a ukulele is apparently a guitar played in imitation of a ukulele by Al Vescovo. It's kind of surprising because the bass player on the track, Lyle Ritz, was famous for his jazz ukulele playing. We'll talk more about both of them later on. Backing vocals are by the group minus Mike, along with Marilyn and, interestingly, Murray, who Brian asked to sing on the track. The simple organ solo by Brian seems designed just to give a little break before we start up again with the ukulele sound and another chorus. Lyrically, this one is akin to Busy Doing Nothing. Both songs look inward, not in a transcendental meditation sense, but in a very distinctly personal Brian Wilson sense. The world seems to revolve around visits and phone calls. And as personal as some of Brian Wilson's lyrics can be, it's hard to get any more personal than the lines, "Stay here on the weekend and unplug the phone. No calls from Korthoff, Parks, or Grillo." Steve Korthoff, of course, is Brian Wilson's cousin and sometimes personal assistant. Along with Arnie Geller, he wrote the liner notes on the back of the Wild Honey album, and in 1969, he and Arnie would become Brian Wilson's partners in the Radiant Radish health food store. John Parks is the Beach Boys road manager of the time, and of course Nick Grillo is the Beach Boys lawyer and business manager. Songwriting credits on the next track, When a Man Needs a Woman, are Brian, Dennis, Al, plus Steve Korthoff and John Parks, both of whom were name-checked on the previous track. This one was recorded on March 18, 1968, the day Mike returned from India, and before the direction of the album had really been settled on. And for that reason, I think it's always set a little bit apart from the other tracks here, though thematically it fits in because it is Brian Wilson talking about what's on his mind, And what's on his mind, of course, is the impending birth of his first child, who, obviously from the lyrics, he's assuming will be a son. About 6 weeks later, Brian and Marilyn welcomed a daughter, Carney Wilson, born April 29th, 1968. This one has always sounded to me like it would have been at home on the Wild Honey album, especially the When a Man Needs a Woman Like a Woman Needs a Man section. Reportedly, Brian recorded a version of it in February before the Friends sessions really got underway in earnest. Maybe he wrote it closer to the Wild Honey sessions, and that's why there's a similar feel. I'm not really sure. It's basically a solo vocal from Brian with some very nice backing vocals on the chorus. As it does on much of the album, Brian's vocal here seems very open and unaffected. There seems to be less of a performance in Brian's vocals on much of this album. He sings very clearly, very beautifully, and often very high. But in some instances, it's like you can almost hear his speaking voice coming through. It's a very sort of open and personal feel to the way he's singing here. The organ solo on this thing, by the way, always reminds me of intermission at a movie. Closing out side one is Brian's beautiful Passing By. As we've talked about before, Brian's instrumentals are usually highlights, and this one is no exception. There are vocals by Brian throughout, of course, but they're wordless. I'd always heard that there had been lyrics originally written to this, and we finally got to hear a version with lyrics on the Wake the World collection in 2018, where it's listed as Passing By Demo. The lead vocal sounds more like a guide than a finished vocal, and it's listed as a demo, but based on what I hear, I definitely prefer the released version. I've always wondered how Brian decided with tracks like Let's Go Away for a Little While to leave them as instrumentals. Having heard the vocal version of this, I think I can venture a guess as to why Passing By stayed instrumental. It seems to me that the melody is all there without the lyrics. The lyrics come off kind of like somebody singing over the radio, not really contributing anything new to the melody. I think for it to work with the lyrics, the wordless vocal would have had to have been mixed very low or mixed completely out. And with the wordless vocal being so beautiful and the lyrics not really adding anything to the melody, I suspect it was an easy call to leave this one as it was, and I'm glad they did. That concludes side one. Let's talk briefly about a couple of tracks on side two before we wind up this episode. Kicking off side two is Anna Lee the Healer. It's written by Mike and Brian with a lead vocal by Mike. According to the booklet included in the 1990 Friends 2020 CD 2 for release, the world of rock and roll can get very tense, and in this tune, the Beach Boys paid tribute to a masseuse. This is not an entirely accurate description of the subject matter. The lyrics came from Mike, who says he met a German woman in Rishikesh who had the ability to cure aches and pains by laying her hands on them. And as reflected in the lyrics, she later came to the U.S. and was a guest at Mike's house. Her real name was Annalisa Braun, and she was a devotee of the Maharishi long before and long after his 1967-68 time as a pop culture sensation. Biographical details about her are really pretty difficult to find. In his two-part feature in the Saturday Evening Post, Louis H. Lapham, who was at Rishikesh covering the Beatles and Mike's time with the Maharishi, mentions her several times, but frustratingly gives very little information, though he does describe her as elfin twice in the article. He does say that she was skeptical of the Beatles' involvement with the Maharishi at first, but warmed to them after meeting them. I'd always pictured her as some kind of hippie flower child, but she would have been much closer in age to the Beach Boys' parents, maybe even a little older, than to the Beach Boys themselves. I did find one photo of her online taken in 1975 in England, along with some information from the photographer who goes by the name Waiting for Train. According to Waiting for Train, she fled Germany to England during World War II with her daughter. Her husband, who was Jewish, failed to escape and didn't survive. She told him that it wasn't until she was in her 40s that she discovered she could sometimes heal people with touch, and that he experienced the warm, tingling, mildly electric sensation that her hands could emit. She admitted that it didn't work on everyone and that any healing wouldn't come immediately. It took several sessions. He describes her as a humble, good person who it was an honor to know. On an album of simple arrangements, this is one of the simplest. Just a piano bass line from Brian, some bass from Carl, percussion by Dennis, lead vocal by Mike, and some typically lovely backing vocals by the whole group. The next track is Little Bird. This was the earliest recorded track to make the album, having been cut at Brian's house back on February 29th, Leap Day of 1968. It's a co-write between Dennis and Steve Kalinich, and arguably Dennis's first real composing contribution to a Beach Boys album. I'm sure a lot of Beach Boy fans were surprised at the gentleness of this and many of Dennis's works that would follow. I know before I heard any of Dennis's music, I would have guessed it would sound like Louie Louie or Jolly Green Giant or something, so I think this probably came as a real surprise and revelation to a lot of people. According to Kalinich, it began as a poem he wrote on his own while hanging out at Dennis's house on Sunset, which Dennis later set to music. Kalinich also says that before the recording session, Brian tinkered with it, changed the melody, and added the "Where's my little bird, she must have flown away" section. Obviously, Brian didn't take credit for those contributions. I always thought the couplet, "Dawn, bird still gone, guess I'll go mow the lawn," was pretty funny. There's all this harmony between man and nature. The bird provides a song, the trout says don't worry, the tree bears fruit, and with the bird still gone, you'd think he would lay down under a tree or meditate or something. Instead, it's dawn and he's cranking up the lawnmower. Maybe it's a push mower, which is a little more pastoral, but still. The arrangement on the backing tracks is actually quite reminiscent of the unreleased stuff from Smile. There's banjo, cellos, and muted trumpet coming in and out of the arrangement. Little Bird was released as the B-side of the Friends single on April 15th, 1968. So that's where we'll leave it for now. Obviously, there's a lot more to talk about, more tracks. We want to talk about the album in sort of more general terms. I really look forward to your comments on what we've discussed so far. I'd love to hear your insights and feedback on that. And if anybody has any additional information, that would be very much appreciated. Hope you'll hit like and subscribe. Always appreciate that too. See you next week, and thanks for watching. Bye.